healthcare and clinics that are dedicated to the full spectrum of women's care be on the chopping block, because the implication is that we are undeserving.
AOC just delivered one of the most fiery speeches of the entire Medicaid debate, and Republicans were ready with a response. The argument started when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez accused Republicans of treating women's healthcare as waste, fraud, and abuse. She warned that defunding Planned Parenthood and restricting reproductive health services would have deadly consequences. According to AOC, women in states with abortion restrictions already face worse outcomes, and she argued that this legislation would only make the situation worse. Then she dropped a line that immediately turned heads. AOC said this bill sends a message that women are part of an undeserving class. She argued that cutting funding for reproductive health care isn't just about budgets or politics, it's about whether women have access to services that can literally save their lives. But Republicans weren't about to let that argument stand unchallenged. Representative Laurel stepped in and accused Democrats of using scare tactics, misinformation, and emotional rhetoric instead of discussing what was actually in the legislation. Lee argued that the bill has nothing to do with denying care to vulnerable Americans. In fact, she claimed the exact opposite. According to Lee, the purpose of the reforms is to preserve Medicaid by making sure resources go to those who truly qualify and need assistance. She argued that the debate had drifted away from facts and into political theater. Suddenly, what began as a discussion about Medicaid spending became a much larger battle over the future of women's health care, government assistance, Planned Parenthood, work requirements, and the role of taxpayer funding. One side claimed lives would be put at risk. The other side claimed the program itself was at risk if reforms weren't made. Neither side backed down. And by the end of the exchange, the debate wasn't really about a single bill anymore. It became a collision between two completely different visions of healthcare in America. Let's break down exactly what happened.
The implication here is that Planned Parenthood is being defunded because women are undeserving of the full spectrum of care that can save their life. Because as the gentlelady from Virginia noted, in states that have banned, outlawed, restricted, defunded abortion services and care, women die at much higher rates. It kills women. It kills women to defund care, reproductive care. It kills women to restrict it, to ban it, to defund it. And this legislation will kill women. That is not a hyperbole. And this provision that defunds Planned Parenthood is telling every woman in the country that you are part of an undeserving class, that you are part of waste, fraud, and abuse as a human being.
At this point, it's necessary to return to the basics of our discussion on Medicaid reform, because the efforts to mislead and the scare tactics and the name-calling have gone on all night. Not just efforts to mislead about the contents and the substance of this legislation, but wholesale attacks on the motives and the integrity of the Republicans sitting on this committee and the Republicans in Congress. The facts are that Republican legislation is about making Medicaid stronger, not weaker. It's about protecting those who truly need it, seniors, people with disabilities, women, low-income families, by ensuring that the program works as it is intended and remains viable, solvent, and secure. Our reforms are targeted, common sense, and urgently needed. First, restoring work requirements for able-bodied Americans without dependents. Requirements that can include work or training. We know that this works in the states who use it, and let us not forget that the value of work requirements as a concept, the value of including these provisions as part of eligibility for government benefits is a concept that was once agreed on both sides of the aisle. Second, we are proposing that we work together to try to identify and stop fraud, waste, and abuse in the program. This is an effort that should have wholesale support across the aisle, whether it is applied to Medicaid or any other government program. And third, we are advocating ending Medicaid payments going to people who are deceased or not eligible. These are not cuts, these are corrections. And here's the most important fact. These reforms are what allows us to direct vital resources where they are truly needed. And it's incorrect to suggest that community health services can only be provided by big abortion. They're community health providers and other health providers operating across America. We have a responsibility to be honest with America. Republican reforms to Medicaid do not take away from the vulnerable. They strengthen and preserve Medicaid, directing benefits to those who need them instead of directing them to those who do not. Doing this is what will ensure that Medicaid is a successful, solvent program for those who need it in America today.
AOC opened with an emotional and forceful argument against the proposed Medicaid reforms. Her focus was on Planned Parenthood and reproductive health services. According to AOC, efforts to defund Planned Parenthood are not simply budget decisions. She argued that they represent a broader message about who deserves access to health care and who doesn't. She warned that restricting or eliminating funding for reproductive health services could have serious consequences for women across the country. Pointing to states that have enacted abortion restrictions, AOC argued that women already face greater health risks when access to care is reduced. Her central claim was straightforward. Reducing funding for reproductive health providers could lead to worse health outcomes and potentially cost lives. AOC also pushed back against efforts to characterize Planned Parenthood as wasteful spending. She argued that the organization provides a wide range of services beyond abortion, including screenings, preventative care, and other health services used by millions of women. In her view, the legislation sends a dangerous message that women's health care is somehow less worthy of support. But Republicans immediately challenged that narrative. Representative Laurel took the floor and accused opponents of misrepresenting the legislation. Lee argued that Democrats were turning a policy debate into an attack on the character and motives of Republicans supporting the bill. According to Lee, the purpose of the legislation is not to weaken Medicaid, but to strengthen it. She emphasized that Medicaid exists to serve vulnerable populations, including seniors, people with disabilities, low-income families, and others who depend on the program. Lee argued that reforms are necessary to ensure Medicaid remains financially sustainable in the future. She outlined three major components of the Republican approach. First, work requirements for able-bodied adults who are not otherwise dependent. Lee argued that these requirements can include employment, education, or job training opportunities. She noted that work requirements have historically received bipartisan support and are intended to encourage self-sufficiency rather than long-term dependency. Second, she focused on fraud, waste, and abuse. Lee argued that protecting taxpayer dollars should not be a partisan issue. She said the government has a responsibility to ensure that benefits go to eligible recipients and that resources are not lost through improper payments or abuse of the system. Third, Lee highlighted efforts to stop payments going to individuals who are no longer eligible or who have died. She argued that these changes should not be described as cuts because the funds were never supposed to be going to those recipients in the first place. Throughout her remarks, Lee repeatedly returned to one theme. These reforms are corrections, not reductions in legitimate benefits. She also challenged the idea that Planned Parenthood is the only source of women's health services in America. Lee pointed to community health centers and other providers across the country that also deliver medical care to women and families. As the debate continued, it became clear that the disagreement